Welcome to The Explainer. Today, we're diving into a story that, believe it or not, starts with a single stand-up joke and spirals into a full-blown, self-funded investigation of an entire American city, Dearborn, Michigan. So what happens when a comedian gets canceled? I mean, we hear that term all the time, right? But for the comedian in our story, Dave Jackson, the consequences went, well, way beyond just losing a few gigs.
Yeah, for Dave Jackson, getting canceled for a joke wasn't the end. Not even close. In fact, it was the very thing that kicked off this huge personal project, his own investigation into Dearborn, Michigan. So let's get into how this whole thing started.
All right, first up, the catalyst. How on earth does one joke lead to an investigation of an entire city? Well, for Jackson, it all kicked off with a pretty controversial bit he did, a joke about a story from an Islamic hadith.
Now, according to Jackson, this wasn't his first rodeo when it came to religious humor. He says he joked about Christianity, Judaism, you name it, and it was, pretty much fine. But he claims that the moment he told a joke based on a story about the Prophet Muhammad, the reaction was totally different. It was immediate, it was severe, and it was like nothing he'd ever dealt with before.
And we're talking about some very specific fallout here. Jackson alleges that this one person, who goes by Champagne Habib, basically led a campaign to ruin his career. We're talking direct threats, serious professional damage. He says his shows started getting canceled left and right, and he was essentially told he could never work in the New York comedy scene again. Just done.
So you can imagine, this whole experience left Jackson with a huge question buzzing in his head. Why? Why did this one religion seem so off-limits for comedy, when others weren't? And his hunt for an answer to that question led him to one specific place: Dearborn, Michigan.
Okay, so why Dearborn? Out of all the places in America, what was it about this one city that drew him in?
Well, let's tick through the reasons he gives. For starters, Dearborn is widely known as America's largest Muslim-majority city. But it wasn't just about the demographics for him. Jackson points to a whole bunch of local stories he'd been tracking, things like a big debate over broadcasting the public call to prayer, a street being named after someone controversial, and even reports of FBI raids and terror plots that, in his view, just weren't getting enough attention from the big news network.
Okay, so Jackson packs his bags and heads to Dearborn, and this is where his investigation really starts to change. He claims he didn't just find stories to report on, he found something else entirely. He describes it as an atmosphere of fear that was just hanging over the whole community.
His core claim? That people there, and not just Muslims, but non-Muslims too, were genuinely afraid to talk openly about any issues connected to Islam. They were worried about, well, some kind of backlash.
And he gives a pretty specific example to back this up. He talks about going to a local church, trying to set up an interview with someone there. But he says as soon as they explained why they were there, they were told, oh no, you have to leave. You can't be here. And boom, they were kicked out. For him, this was Exhibit A, direct proof of that climate of fear he was talking about.
So, he feels like he's hitting a wall trying to talk to people on the street. What's his next move? He decides to take his questions right to the top, to the city's elected officials during a public city council meeting.
And he did not hold back. He stood up at that meeting and directly challenged the council members. He basically accused them of being hypocrites, and he brought up another local minister who had apparently been branded an Islamophobe for asking similar kinds of questions.
And this whole exchange led Jackson to form a theory about why he felt the council was so quiet. He came to believe that, look, in a city where Muslims are the majority, the politicians absolutely depend on that voting bloc to stay in office, and because of that, they're just not going to touch any controversial issues that might upset those voters.
All right, and this is where the story takes a pretty wild turn. After that city council meeting, Jackson claims he got a tip about a very mysterious building, a place that he started calling the safe house. The person who tipped him off apparently warned him, stay away from there, it's dangerous. And the location? It was right next to a mosque, which just made the whole thing even more intriguing to him.
So, what does he say he found when he went inside? The footage he shot shows this space just filled with stuff. Vats, containers, all kinds of tubing. It really looked like some kind of manufacturing was going on. And his gut reaction right then and there, he says it looked almost 100% a meth lab. He also claims he found what he called a secret back entrance that connected to the area right by the mosque.
Okay, so all of this leads him to cook up what he calls his joint operation theory. Now we got to be clear here. This is his working theory based on what he saw and what he says locals told him. The theory is that a biker gang is actually running the facility as a meth lab, and they're using a local network of Arabs for distribution.
Now, to try and support this pretty big claim, Jackson connects it to other reports of organized crime in the area. He points to a big 2-year investigation that had recently busted an organized crime ring that was stealing cars. For him, this was a precedent. It showed that the kind of criminal cooperation he was alleging was, at least in his mind, possible.
So Jackson wraps up his investigation, puts together all his footage, and drops a documentary about the whole thing on YouTube. So what happened after he hit publish?
Well, according to him, the aftermath was intense. He says that almost immediately after the documentary went live, the owner of that building, the alleged safe house, threatened to sue him, and that was just the start. He also reports getting flooded with all kinds of other threats, including, he says, death threats.
So when you look at this whole chain of events, right, from one joke to a full-blown documentary, it was all driven by this one guy's investigation. And it really leaves us with a big question to think about. In a world where anyone with a camera can be an investigator and a publisher, who really gets to tell a community's story? And more importantly, what are the consequences for the people who actually live there?